Hey everyone, I'm Benj Gershman. This is What Could Be Bad. I am here today with a very special guest, Mr. Ryan Dusick, the original drummer from Maroon 5, a friend of mine from way back in the day when we were touring together. We did the Jeep World Outside Festival. We did a tour where somehow Maroon 5 was actually opening up for O.A.R. I don't quite think that'll ever happen again or anything like that. It was a pretty wild experience and time in life. Really happy to be here today. We are going to dive into all kinds of things. Ryan is an incredible person, and he has been through a lot. He has a wonderful book that I've had the pleasure of reading. It's called Harder to Breathe, and he chronicles what he went through as a young person building a band, going all the way through, establishing the band through rigorous touring, which I can relate to quite a lot, and then having some fallout from that as your body gave you some feedback on what it was going through. And that caused some changes in your life that we're going to talk about. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity because of all the podcasts that I think I'm going to get to record, it's really personal, to talk with you because your experience reflects my experience. And I think in ways my experience will reflect yours. So getting into this and diving into it could start in a lot of places, but I'd really like to begin as, a teenager, as a young person. What was it like trying to work out how a band could be a band for you, and what did it feel like? Because to me, it's really, really the most special time is that, inner figuring it out that nobody sees. Yeah. And that's a really special time in life that we all, once you get older, you want to go back there in one way or another. But I'm curious for you, you detail it in the book, but, I think this is another opportunity to share some moments. Is there, some kind of story you'd be able to start us off with that kind of chronicles those young days building Maroon 5?
It's funny when people ask me about my time in the band, and in some ways it feels like another lifetime, in some ways it feels like just yesterday. Mm-hmm. And when people ask me, they seem to be wanting like the stories of the glitz and the glamour of success and fame and all that. And that stuff was fun too. But when I think back on that time in my life, it's the stuff you're describing that I miss the most.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, that's the good stuff. That's the fun stuff. When you get to the highest level, everything can start to kind of look the same day after day.
Sure.
But on your way up, when you're starting out in your garage,
yeah,
and you're figuring out just how to play together, what's our sound going to be, watching it evolve over time. That to me is like the essence of artistry and creativity and finding your voice.
Sure.
And so those memories and just the kinship between the members of the band, the collaboration, I think that what was most interesting for us, I think when you're in the middle of it, you take it for granted that this experience is not something that everyone is having.
Yeah.
And I knew that there was something special about the chemistry of the original four members, but at the same time, I kind of thought this is what it's like to be in a band for everyone. But we had very disparate personalities, even though we were all on the same page in terms of the kind of music we were playing, who our influences were. Early on, it was grunge. It was before it was Maroon 5. It was Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains.
Yeah, for us too. I think actually Mark and Chris and Richard, before I was in the group, played as another band in the middle school talent show and covered Pearl Jam. And it wasn't grunge, it was Eric Clapton was the other song. But I was actually in the audience that night watching them do it. And I remember that being an inspirational thing too. But that's awesome that you guys, we grew up in that same era. I think we're basically the same age, and trajectory was happening around the same time and everything, even though, things went different directions in that regard.
Yeah, we started the band in 94 when I was 16 years old.
Okay.
And I was, I think 14 when Smells Like Teen Spirit came out and Nirvana and all that stuff started. So we were all on the same page with that at the start. That was our music. That was everything that propelled us forward. But I think the team that became originally Cars, Flowers, and then Maroon 5 was a very disparate group of personalities.
Yeah.
Adam's kind of this savant talent,
Sure.
But a little scatterbrained by nature. He'll talk about he was an ADD kid, and so a hard time kind of focusing. and just kind of impulsive by nature. Like he would just follow whatever impulse he had, which as a creative person can be a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
By nature, I'm a perfectionist. I'm kind of obsessive compulsive. We were like an odd couple in that regard, opposites.
Sure.
And you could look at that as like, that would have been terrible. You would have just frustrated each other. How's that going to work?
You could see that. But I think that's also like the beauty of a relationship too, is like the people aren't exactly the same who have strong relationships. A lot of times they're so different that they complement one another.
Exactly. That's kind of what I was getting at. It was a complementary in that he needed me to give him a little bit of that organization and, just work ethic.
Yeah.
But I needed him to get out of, that rigidity, that's being obsessive about things to a fault. So I think that we were a nice balance for each other in that way. And then the other guys also had their own unique things that they brought to the table. So it was like synergy, the fact that these disparate people came together to complement each other and actually improve on what it was that we were bringing. I
get that. And I think that's one of the really essential parts of like the chemistry of a group.
Yeah.
Because if everyone's trying to do it the exact same way, it's kind of flat. When you have elements that move together, it like not only sonically has a lot of, changes and just texture, but I think the emotion of each individual kind of, keeps building on itself. But it's also when do you feel like when you were back in the, in the mid 90s, as we were trying to figure out what we were going to be, who we were, and a lot of that was just kind of through the natural process of it. Do you feel like you guys had to try to figure it out, or was it sort of like an authentic process of just playing and, it built out of itself, or was it like an intentional thing at that young age, or was there a direction to trying to find a certain sound? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
Like, because I think that's also a part of being a young band, is like you're finding yourself at the same time you're finding a band and the sound of the band. At least for me, like I remember we like digging into like roots rock kind of stuff was like, oh, like that feels really good. But I didn't have a lot of experience with islandy type music. For you guys, when you started in the grunge stuff, did you choose to try to get out of that, or was it like just a natural progression for you?
It was a combination of both over time. There was definitely an evolution that happened. It wasn't like we woke up one day and said, we need to find our sound today. Early on, there wasn't a whole lot of intentionality beyond just being inspired and following what our inspirations and our impulses, where that led us. But at a certain point later, we did become more intentional about it. I think because of the failures that we had along the way. You have to remember, it was 10 years, 94 to 2004, from when we started the band to when we had our first platinum record. It was a full decade.
Yeah.
So, and for me, age 16 to age 26. So
long time.
You're growing up. You're becoming an adult from a teenager during that time. Our friendship and our just the chemistry that I was describing, that evolved over time in terms of how we related to each other. And our influences changed. But I think early on, we just came together and it was natural. It was just a natural chemistry. It was, we didn't overthink it that much. We just kind of did what we did and it evolved. But pretty quickly, our influences changed and the sound began to change. And by the time we got our first record deal, we were more of a power pop kind of band, Weezer, Green Day sort of influence thing, but then really heavily into the Beatles and the 60s, mod and Britpop kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that record tanked. We thought that was our ticket to stardom. That we were going to go off on the road and have this big hit. That's not how it played out. And so we kind of had to go back to the drawing board. And that's when we did get more intentional about it, because we knew that we couldn't repeat what we had already done. That hadn't worked.
Yes.
So we had to find something new and different. And we had no idea what that was going to be. So we went through a phase for a year or two there where we were just trying everything. We did some stuff that was kind of folky. We did stuff that was kind of, even islandy and jammy jam band kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, Adam was listening to a lot of Fish and Dave Matthews Band, and there was a lot of crossover. I mean, there's a reason why we ended up, even though a lot of people would listen to O.A.R. and listen to Maroon 5 and wouldn't necessarily hear that we're similar bands, there's a reason why we had a kinship, I think.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the same roots. And Adam and Jesse in particular were really into that jammy kind of thing, whereas at that time, me and Mickey were not on that page at all.
Yeah.
So there was a rift that kind of happened for a little while there, for 6 months to a year after that first record, where we were trying to figure out who we were and is this even going to work? Are we even on the same page anymore? But somehow, miraculously, after spending a little bit of time apart from each other, we came back together, and it turned out that we were all listening to the same music again. And we're heavily inspired by classic soul and R&B and hip hop, new hip hop. And it was just kind of a weird thing because Adam and Jesse had been in New York for like 6 months, and Mickey and I were back at UCLA. And we came back together, and we were all listening to Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye and Michael Jackson and Prince and Missy Elliott and Lauryn Hill and Busta Rhymes. I mean, like, we were just...
That's awesome.
It was really strange. And then we became much more intentional because we realized that was unique.
Yeah.
I mean, we were 4 white guys from Brentwood High School, and it was a little audacious for us to pretend that we pulled that off because we really hadn't even played that style before.
Right.
We had grown up on it. I mean, I grew up in the 80s.
Who hasn't listened to Stevie Wonder and these people, right? Like,
exactly. So, but I think that there was a moment there where we were like, are we going to do this? And are we going to go all the way with it?
Yeah.
And there was a very specific moment when I was kind of fooling around, listening to a lot of really modern hip-hop beats, like Timbaland beats, the Neptunes.
Yeah.
And I would come into rehearsals and start playing some of those kind of beats on the drums, and everyone would kind of chuckle and be like, wouldn't it be fun if we did something like that?
Yeah.
And Jesse was like, play that again. Let me try to come up with something. And within 20 minutes, just doing that, we came up with the basis of the song Not Coming Home. And that was a huge turning point. We all kind of like felt the energy in the room, like this was a rebirth of the sound of the band, that we had stumbled onto something that, because it didn't sound like a hip hop track. I mean, it sounded like us doing an impression of a hip hop track.
Sure.
But it was such a departure for us, and it felt audacious, and it was exciting to us. So I think when you get that feeling, when all of a sudden the hair on your arm stands up, and you're like, we're on to something here. And Adam, I think, found his voice both as a lyricist and as a vocalist at that point, because he had been listening to so much of that soul music.
Yeah.
And he would sing that way when he wasn't with the band, just when he was in his car and stuff. And then all of a sudden, doing it with the band, he realized that was where he had a unique tonal, sound to the way that he expressed himself. And then the lyrics started to flow, because he wasn't a natural lyricist either. I mean, the early songs, he hadn't found his voice in that regard. He was kind of doing an impression of our 90s heroes, which was oftentimes just kind of nonsensical. But now he had grown into himself a little bit. He was a young man talking about the pain of relationships and broken hearts. And so just all of those things kind of met up at this moment, and we all kind of looked at each other and we knew we were onto something. And that's when it became very intentional.
Can I ask you about the friends that you guys had? Because I know, like you guys, like you originally were playing a lot of shows for, the people that were really close in your circle. When you guys began to find your sound and move out of sort of the grunge and those things, what was the reaction like for the people that had known you? Did they welcome that? Did they feel like it was, a good thing? Did that feel like warm and fuzzy to you guys? Based, on their reaction, how did that go?
It was a mixed bag at first. We had some friends and other musicians that we had played with that they saw it as us selling out. They were like, oh my God, they're going for the pop mainstream.
It's such a term that I can't even get started on like the depth of my feelings about that term, selling out. Because what is it? To have a career, you have to sell things. Like you can't, not move forward. You know what I mean? And who does it? Like if you start a band, you want to be a big band. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Yeah. And the thing was, for us, the idea that the word pop was a bad word. It's like our favorite artists of all time. And the Beatles, Stevie Wonder, Prince and Michael Jackson in our lifetime. Yeah. I mean, all of these artists were mainstream pop artists.
Totally.
Just because you're selling a lot of records doesn't mean that you can't do something incredibly inspiring and interesting with that. And quite the contrary. I think that if you're within the mold and structure and framework of a certain kind of music like that, you have to be that much more creative to do something unique.
Absolutely.
To stand out of the crowd.
Right. It's still the artistry that's going to stand out. And it's like it's almost harder to like simplify down to a pop song than to get really wild with whatever you're doing that's totally like out there, I think. Because it's like you're bearing down on the most core part of what the music is.
Yeah, and so we had that reaction from some people. It's like, oh, they're trying to be that. But then James, who ended up being the 5th member of the band, James Valentine, he tells a funny story because he was just a fan and he had just moved to LA. He would come to the shows. And he knew us as Cars Flowers, who were this power pop band and had been turned into sort of a jam band. And then we played the song Not Coming Home for the first time, and he was in the audience. And he tells a story where he was looking around at his friends, and everyone was kind of looking around like, are they joking?
Yeah.
Like, is this serious, or is this like a silly thing they're doing? But they were like, but it's kind of awesome.
Yeah. It's like, do we trust them? Is this okay? Do we trust ourselves to like this because it's so different? Yeah.
Right, exactly. And we hit that harmony in the chorus that was like very inspired by Michael Jackson. And Adam and Jesse and I weren't really a 3-part harmony singing group. I mean, Adam and Jesse sang a lot of harmonies. I was just starting to do a little bit of adding something on top, and it was almost joking. You know, we were serious.
You're like putting your toe in the water a little bit. Like, is this okay to do?
Yeah, because it was like silly for me to be doing a falsetto harmony on top of Adam singing like a very soulful Michael Jackson kind of line.
Sure.
But the first time we sang that hook, I mean, not even like the first song, like the end of the first song, in the middle of the first song, the first time we hit that, you could see a palpable reaction in the audience. They were like,
that's awesome.
And everyone cheered right at that breakdown.
That's so cool.
And so we were looking at each other like, okay, this is...
Yeah, like it felt right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big moment when you're in a live situation and you play something for the first time and you have that like testing ground. I think it's a very valuable thing for a band to have is like those stages of growth where you guys can like test those waters and find it. And I think that's probably an example of, you know, like where great bands come out of is they like, you know, they have these moments of like, oh, this is working. We need to go in this direction. You know, this other one didn't kind of flow for us. But as you guys figured out that you're kind of, we can call it, I don't know, like the R&B pop direction, I guess. I'm not one for labels that much or whatever, but I think I'm curious too, figuring out how to continue writing like that. And as a band all have, because like when I listen to that record, like you all have a voice within the voice of the band. Like there's really like solid, intricate parts for everybody, even though, you know, there's pop to it and it's simplified down and all that, but it's like you guys each have a very strong showing of the players that you are, and you're all wonderful musicians. But I'm wondering, like for you as a drummer, because you didn't grow like initially through that, you know, music, even though you were inspired by it and it was a part of your, you know, musical, I guess, background or whatever. Did you find that it was difficult to craft beats for that, or was it very natural to do so?
Well, it was an interesting transition because when I first started playing the drums were freedom and expression to me, and I looked at it as I just wanted to make as much noise as I could possibly make, and I was, you know, twirling my drumsticks, and you have to remember, I started playing in the late 80s. Yeah. It was the era of Tommy Lee.
Totally, like stick flipping. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was Headbangers Ball and glam rock and all that stuff. Yeah. And then it quickly transitioned to Dave Grohl and the early 90s style.
Bless that era.
Yeah, I mean, but it was still just like bashing and really heavy. And that was my style, man. My favorite bands were Soundgarden and Tool and Rage Against the Machine.
Awesome.
So, I mean, but I liked that crossover where there was groove, like Rage Against the Machine. There was groove in the heaviness.
So much.
And I think that I had a natural knack for that, but I'd never thought of myself as somebody who was going to play like slick R&B or pop grooves.
Yeah.
Until all of a sudden I was like, oh no, we've written this music.
Yeah.
We have to execute it.
We have to go that way, yeah.
And so in my mind, it was kind of like walking a fine line between staying expressive and allowing myself to have that freedom of expression that I enjoyed so much as a drummer early on, but also wanting to service the music and the song in the way that our favorite artists in that genre did. So it was complicated. I had never even played to a metronome or anything like that before. So the idea...
The dreaded click track.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone who doesn't know that experience...
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I mean, nowadays it's probably more common that...
Right, like you grew up with it?
Yeah, because everyone's doing everything on Pro Tools, on the grid, or some program. Drummers are much more metronomic today, I think. When I see half the guys you see like on Instagram Reels playing, or even when you turn on and you see someone performing on the Tonight Show or whatever, I'm just like, there weren't drummers like this when I was growing up. These guys are so precise and incredibly, it's like robotic almost, but expressive at the same time. I'm not knocking it, but I'm just, for me, especially, I think in particular the early 90s, it was the time you could get away with being sloppiest the most.
Yes. I totally relate to this because for us, our first studio experience, it was loose. I think if you listen to some of those first recordings, you can hear like 6 tempos in the same song, and then we get to we get a deal, we signed with Lava Records. Shout out to Jason Flum and Greg Nadell, great people who helped us early in our career. And, Dave Roberge, our early manager, they're all helping us find a way to sort of change a little bit, to grow our sound. And they're like, we're going to get you in the studio, okay, great. We get in there, we're working with John Alasia and Jeff Giuliano, and here comes the click track. Pro Tools is happening for the first time, and it's hard for everybody, but for the drummer, that is such a challenge because if you've never been in that, to have everything, to your point of rigidity, but also you can zoom in so close, you can see if you're a quarter of a millisecond off, and then, they can shift that drum sound to be directly on the beat. Which to me, it takes some of the feel out, just the way I guess I had up to that point really enjoyed playing very loosely and didn't realize it. But then when you get in that environment, it's a real anxiety driving experience. And I remember even the bass parts, like watching you don't see the click moving, so to speak. You can see the click, what do they call it? Not a histogram, but why am I blanking on this? The graphing or whatever of where the notes hit. And then you're watching time move. And it's like, if you're before it or after it, to me, I'm like, I fucked up, God, And so, I mean, as a drummer, I know what my brother Chris did, and went through, and it was not easy, and God bless him. But how did that affect you?
It was also an interesting role reversal in the band at that point, because I had been the stickler for us practicing more, getting tighter. Adam, we'd have rehearsals, and the history of the band was we'd come in, it would take us an hour just to get going because everyone was scattered all over the place, to actually sit down and start working on a song. We'd work on it for 20 minutes, half an hour, and then Adam would say, let's get lunch. And so I was the one being sort of the type A personality who was trying to get us to be more professional and really just being more compulsive about it. But Adam had been recording his demos with Sam Farrar, who's now in the band. He's now the bass player in the band.
Love them, yeah.
And he was a close friend of ours and a great producer, engineer on the way up. And Adam was doing a lot of his demos. After we made the initial demos for Songs About Jane and we were writing more and more material, Adam just started laying down tracks to program beats with Sam. Yeah. So he had been in the studio kind of tinkering with real modern production style. And I was kind of still thinking, well, yes, we're influenced by that sound, and we may want to work with a producer who knows how to execute that, but we still want to sound like a rock band.
And a live rock band.
Exactly. Yeah. And maybe some of that was my taste. Maybe some of it was just giving myself enough room to say well, it doesn't have to be perfect because I don't know if I can play it quite like a loop,
Yeah.
But we get into the studio, and now we are doing it to a grid in Pro Tools for the first time. And I'm the one arguing for things being looser and like, come on guys, let's chill out. And I have Adam and the whole band literally just in the tracking booth, in the control room.
Sure.
Watch, and we're after I play a take, like going through bar by bar. It's like, we got to fix that, let's try to fly this in over here, let's edit. And it was, for me, somebody who's a perfectionist, it was the first time that my perfection was coming from an external source. Because everyone had just told me, oh, you're great, you're so great, like you have natural knack for the drums. And now all of a sudden it's like, no, it's not good enough.
Yeah.
It needs to be more perfect.
Humbling.
So that was, it was very humbling. But I do have to say that my instincts were right, even though it may have been slightly self-serving for my ego at the time. Because we did, the first pass, we just like edited it to hell. We were looping tracks, we were doing everything, trying to make it sound like a hip-hop pop production. And we were all, when we finished that first pass of recording, we're like, there's something not working here. It feels really stiff. It feels really dead.
Yeah.
And the record label came in. It's usually the record label comes in and says it's not good enough.
Yeah.
Like you need to make it more produced.
Yeah.
They're like, what are you guys doing? We've signed a live band. This doesn't sound like a live band. So we went back and re-recorded live drums on like half of those recordings.
Oh, man.
And so I got to go in and just play loose and live.
Yeah.
And those are some of my favorite recordings. Like Sunday Morning, for instance. That's just like one take of me playing the drums on top of everything that had already been recorded.
Okay.
And then actually Mickey had to go back and redo the bass because it wasn't really lining up perfectly. But
sure.
When I listened to that track, it's like the perfect combination of that jazzy kind of push and pull of a live performance, but then that tightness that was more of where we were going. So I look at that record as just unique in that regard. It's like it has a sonic dynamism that is different than a lot of other records in either style.
Yes.
Because it's not all the way just like a live rock band, and it's not all the way like a tight R&B hip hop kind of thing. It's somewhere in between. And it was also at a moment in time, I think, 2002 when that record came out, when there was that transition from the 90s to what you hear today.
Yes.
Where things have become much more electronic and much more programmed and produced.
Yeah, like an incredibly large amount different. Like in that, I love live bands, and so I've always loved that record because it does, to me, it sounds like a very great live band that is produced well. It's not like, it's not so left of center that you don't get that these guys can play live. Like you can feel it, all those songs. For you in that, I mean, I remember in the book, something that was really interesting to me is that you had always wanted to make an album that was like, your Dark Side of the Moon, I think might have been the example, or something along those lines. Was that then? And you didn't realize you were doing that at the time. Before we move forward in your life, I'm curious now, looking back at that point in your life, knowing that, in my opinion, you guys created one of the greatest albums of my lifetime. And I'm just curious, like, that you've kind of been able to see the success of the record now, and knowing that you did accomplish that. I think your late manager shared that with you and sort of pointed that out to you. Is that correct? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, Jordan Feldstein, Jordy. That was a great moment for me that I talk about in the book. Because the reference point that you're referring to in terms of an album was the Chili Peppers, Blood Sugar Sex Magic.
I should have remembered that because I'm a huge fan of that. Yeah,
sure,
okay.
Sure. You're a bass player.
Yeah,
you gotta be.
Yeah.
Not that Dark Side of the Moon wasn't a reference point as well. I mean, I certainly, when you're talking about iconic generational albums,
yes.
I mean, that's like one of the ones of that era. But for our generation, the early 90s, and what we were trying to do in terms of the combination of influences, because the Chili Peppers, of course, were a rock band that were heavily influenced by funk and obviously hip hop and rap.
Yes.
And they managed to make this record that was just this amalgam of all these different influences. And it just hit so hard, but was so funky. It had that consistency and that drive of like almost a looped dance beat kind of sound,
right?
But then it had that live energy. Totally. It just all clicked for them in the recording of that record, and It just seemed like it was the perfect intersection of doing something much more pop than they'd ever done. They had pop hits on that record. It blew them up to this enormous scale of selling millions of records and selling out arenas and all that stuff.
Yes.
That was clearly what they were going for, but at the same time, it was very true to their roots, and it was very soulful, and clearly just a really authentic expression of all of their influences.
Yeah.
And so that was what we aspired to most, was to try to do all those things at once. It started to become more and more audacious, to the point where we were even talking about making like Michael Jackson Thriller. That was, because Adam's, I think that he can be grandiose in the way that he's always moving forward, always wanted to do something.
Comic relief. I love it. Yeah.
Somebody hit a cymbal.
Yeah.
But as we were going into the studio, I think we were thinking we wanted to make like Thriller, and we wanted to have like, 10 tracks that were all potential hits. That was kind of the idea.
Yeah.
But in the back of our minds, it was like, we want to be authentic to ourselves and soulful in the way that Blood Sugar Sex Magic was.
Yeah.
And so when we made Songs About Jane, and we were going through the process of it, we were under a lot of pressure. I mean, the song Harder to Breathe came out of the pressure we were under. I know Adam wrote that lyric, like the record label was breathing down our throats to write a hit, and we thought we had written hits, but they wanted more hits. That's what record labels do, right?
Always, yeah, never enough.
Right, so under all of that pressure and putting a lot of pressure on ourselves, this was our second record deal. We knew it was now or never time at like 24. If we didn't have a hit now, this was the end of our careers.
Yeah.
And we thought we were failing. We thought we blew it. This record is not everything it needs to be. All we could hear, because we were so inside of it, you're in the middle of a project.
Yeah.
All you can hear is the imperfections. And we were living and breathing this thing every day, that when we finally had to just put it to bed and be done with it, we thought, well, we failed. Well, we gave it our best shot, and we'll go out and we'll tour and do the best we can to try to promote this piece of crap. But
isn't that ironic?
Yeah, but boy, were we wrong,
Totally.
Of course.
Yeah.
And it's only been in like years and decades later that I've been able to look back and really, truly appreciate how special that was, and that we couldn't see it when we were in the middle of it. I knew that what we were doing was special, but we just didn't think that the recording was special. So unfortunately, I, of course, had to walk away from the band before we got to make the follow-up record. And we were writing material for the follow-up record, and I did have some influence on some of what ended up on the next album, but I wasn't able to play the drums on the next record. And in my mind, I had thought, well, okay, we had success with this record. The next one is going to be our Blood Sugar Sex Magic. That's going to be the record that we really accomplish everything we envision as the intersection of our inspirations, our influences, and our goals, but also our heart and our authenticity.
Yeah.
And not getting to do that, I felt like I was really missing out on something, and maybe the band wouldn't get to do it because it wouldn't be the original members, and we wouldn't have the same chemistry. They wouldn't have the same chemistry without me there.
Yeah, I get that.
Jordy, the band's manager, sent it to me to listen to and give him some feedback, and I was like, Jordy, this sounds great. It sounds a really well-produced record. The songs are really good. Adam sounds better than ever. I'm sure it's going to be a big hit. I just can't help but notice that the productions are getting even bigger and bigger and more slick. And for my taste, it's like the band's moving further and further away from what we were just stumbling on with Songs About Jane, which was really special. And he said, well, I think that's a natural progression for the band. I mean, when you have a hit, you tend to move more towards more of the mainstream sort of success, and I think that you can't really go backwards. And I said, I agree with that. I said, but I just felt like we had our Blood Sugar Sex Magic in us, and the band hasn't really done that yet, and I fear that it's never going to happen if it keeps moving in that direction, because it's moving further from our roots. And he said, I hate to break it to you, Ryan, but I think Songs About Jane was the band's Blood Sugar Sex Magic. It was all the things that you just described. I mean, it was that intersection of doing something that crossed over to a mainstream audience, but it was still authentic and soulful.
Yeah.
And it was still, really connected to your influences and your inspirations, and not entirely just a part of the machine at that point. And so him putting it that way, it helped me appreciate Songs About Jane that much more, and to be that much more grateful for what we had done. Because here I was, for however long it had been at that point, 7-8 years since I left the band, thinking to myself, I had missed out on the best part. And then I recognized, no, I was in the band for 12 years, from my parents' garage all the way to having one of the biggest albums of the decade.
Yeah.
And that was the best part. That's the part that you live for as a band. I mean, all the success is great. And of course, I envy that. I wish that I could have been around for that part of it more.
Sure.
But I got to be there for, and a big part of the stuff that was the most exciting and the most inspiring part of the journey.
Yeah, I think building the foundation for something like that is so special. And it's so vital to where things go after that. And that like there's that basis for everything that you helped create. You know, you were a big part of that. And I wonder, as your health issues became more and more apparent, what was it like to deal with knowing that you couldn't alter the course of where things were going with, I mean, mainly your shoulder, the nerve issues in your shoulder, right? But then it transferred to other things at times. But I mean, what was it like to realize that you had to bow out, you had to step away?
It was the hardest thing I've ever gone through in my life. You know, I'm sure you can tell, like the tone in my voice changes just talking about that now. It's still painful, you know.
Yeah.
I have closure about that chapter.
That's good.
It took a long time to come to a place of acceptance.
Yeah.
But it'll always be something that was traumatic for me. I think the thing that was hardest about it at the time was that I couldn't really understand what was happening.
With your body?
With
or
my
with
body
the band?
and my mind.
Yeah.
Because it was so complicated, the combination of things that led to my having to walk away from the band. Mm-hmm. The only way that I could really internalize it or make any sense of it was that I was a failure, that there was something defective about me. Because I knew that it was more than just the pain I had in my shoulder and the fact that it was getting harder to get through sets because of the pain and because I was having to contort and change my mechanics to try to get through it. You know, I went to a lot of doctors and I went to several orthopedists who said, well, I don't see anything we can like operate on. There's inflammation in the shoulder, but you just need rest and physical therapy. Even just hearing that, I knew that wasn't the whole story. I just didn't know what the whole story was. So all I could do was kind of think to myself, well, then that means there's something wrong with me on a more global scale. It's not just an injury. Because it went from just pain in the shoulder and having a harder time getting through sets to losing coordination, losing the ability to actually just coordinate things that were once very easy for me. Mm-hmm. And it was degrading over time. And at the time, I knew something more was going on, but there was no dialogue about mental health.
Sure. That's why we're here talking about this. Yeah.
That's why I'm talking about it now and why I've kind of made a life out of this, because it would have been so helpful for me at that moment if there were more of a public discourse about these things and to understand wellness and to understand that the human mind, body, and spirit can only take so much, that you need to treat it with kindness and compassion. Otherwise, eventually you're going to pay the price for the demands that you put on it. Yeah. And it was just such a grueling life. And I'll try to lay out the many different things that were factors, just so you get a sense. I mean, I did have a pre-existing injury. Yes. I was a pitcher in high school, and I had tendonitis in my shoulder that was pretty chronic. That definitely would play a factor. I had previous injuries even. I had torn my shoulder when I was like 10 years old. I've done a lot to this right arm over the years. Yeah. I broke my hand when I was in school. I mean, I had a lot of injuries, and I was very heavily dominant with my right hand as a drummer because I never learned, that's the second
proper mechanics and stuff like that.
Yeah, I never took lessons. I'd never learned paradiddles or any kind of rudiments or anything. And so just my technique was not great. When I watch video of me when I was a teenager playing, like it looks pretty good actually, because I just had a natural knack for picking up how to coordinate certain things. But what I was lacking was just the fundamentals of how to reduce the amount of strain you're putting on your body, how hard you have to work. I was essentially approaching the drums like an athletic endeavor, like going out there and hitting a punching bag for an hour.
Trying to hit home runs every time.
Yeah. And so that's fine when you're playing one show a month for your friends.
Not when you're road dogging for 2 years straight,
And you go from being an opening act playing 30-minute sets to all of a sudden headlining playing 90-minute sets. Yeah. And the jet lag and all the stuff that goes along with it. So just on the very basic physical level,
Right.
there was a lot that was breaking me down. That might have been enough, to cause irreparable damage. But it was also the incredible amount of strain. Being somebody who put a lot of pressure on myself already, now having the bright lights of being on the biggest stages in the world, being on live television, on Saturday Night Live and all that stuff, there was this external pressure that was meeting up with the internal pressure, already feeling like I couldn't hack it. And that, imposter syndrome that a lot of people, I think, can relate to in any industry, even if they're very well prepared to be doing what they're doing. But I felt like I really wasn't, because now we were in this pop world with a bunch of musicians who were highly trained people.
Yep.
It wasn't garage rock anymore. It was,
technical.
Guys, like Juilliard trained drummers who would be warming up backstage. And it was like, and I was like, I can't do that.
Yeah.
And the fact that they can do that means that I'm not equipped for certain things. And so there was just the self-doubt, and there was the emotional feeling of not being good enough. And then my spirit was just degrading because of that, because it was day after day, night after night, and burying it, pushing down the feelings, not having an outlet for that. So that takes a toll.
It does. And I can relate to sort of the falling away of yourself in that, because when I went through my health issues in 2020 through 2022, my identity was like degraded, and eventually I couldn't hold an instrument for a while. And it really, when that starts happening, I was in the pandemic, so it was layers in another way. Mm-hmm. But when you stop being able to perform in a way that you're proud of, it really takes you out of yourself. And I wonder if that's, you think, maybe what led you to falling deeper into alcoholism, or if it's sort of the other way around, that alcoholism just exacerbated the problems. Do you think it was like one went with the other, or is it kind of one led to the other?
Well, first off, it's so interesting how our stories kind of dovetail in that way, and I look forward to your book.
It's happening. I'm working on it. I might hit you up for some ideas before it's out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Feedback and
more
such.
than happy to help with my experience. I learned a lot of what not to do as well as what to do.
I'd love to learn that from you. Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
So, to answer your question, the alcohol crept up on me. I think it did play a factor. It became a bigger problem after I left the band, but I think it did play a factor just in my inability to cope with what was happening.
Okay.
I started drinking. I was a late bloomer in terms of alcohol, whereas most of my friends in high school obviously were experimenting with alcohol and pot and whatever else.
Yeah.
I was a goody two shoes. I didn't do any of that stuff, and because I was the overachiever and the perfectionist, and I held myself to the standard of what my parents would expect of me. Right?
Good for you. It seems like it would be a good thing if more people tried that.
Sure, except that I think that I probably took it to the opposite extreme.
Okay.
Which I find, we tend to do that. We overcorrect. If something's extreme on one end, we tend to go to the other end of the spectrum, when something in the middle would have been a balanced approach and maybe healthier.
I get that.
Having been so rejecting of it, and so having sort of a stick up my butt about a lot of things that my peers were doing, when I finally got to a place in my life when I was like so uptight in my early 20s and realizing I needed to let loose, I probably went more overboard at that point.
I see.
As a
bottled
compensation.
up or something.
Yeah, and I think that I was like the first time I actually had a social experience where I let loose a little bit and I was drinking, I realized like, oh, this is what people drink for, because it's a lubricant, and all these ways in which I feel self-conscious so much of the time, and I'm so obsessive about doing the right thing and all that. I was able to let go of that, and I felt more present. That's what I noticed early on, even when it wasn't a problem, was that I actually felt like I was able to be myself more. I was the best version of myself. I was more social. I was wittier, and all the lies we tell ourselves.
I know, right? I've been there too. I think there's a reason why, like, you opt out of that, or you did opt out of that. I've been considering lately, like, maybe I should become sober. I don't do anything like I used to because of my health issues, and anytime I do, it's like apparent why I should maybe not do it. For physical reasons more than I feel like I need them. Not to get off subject from you, but that's something I'm grappling with on a daily basis, including the past 2 days when my body is, talking back to me in ways that I haven't heard in 8 or 9 months, and I'm having back issues and all that. But I think as human beings, like, we want to connect. And if, to use your word, lubricant, it's not a sexual joke, but certainly used for that too. But I think that's a good word for it, because it loosens you up and it helps things slide, and to be able to connect with people when you're dealing with something, it does make you feel better. And it's not about the lubricant, it's about the connection, I think. And it puts you in that space, but quickly it can go away from that, and it can become detrimental to your well-being. And I'm curious, did you see a time when that was happening, but you didn't do anything about it yet? And like, where was the moment where you actually were like, okay, like, this is my breaking point. Like, I need to change.
I look at my relationship with alcohol like a romantic relationship, with the whole arc of the romantic beginnings of it, the honeymoon period, when there begins to be problems, and when it becomes completely toxic and you have to decide to move on from it. Early on, I mean, in those early years of my drinking, from probably age 21, 22 through 24, 25, I look at still to this day as like the best time in my life, because I felt I had the greatest social life. I felt really connected to my friends. It was fun and exciting. It was at that moment when we were writing the music that became songs about Jane, and then making songs about Jane. So it was an inspiring and incredibly memorable, adventurous time in my life. And I just wanted to take that with me on the road and try to have as much fun as I could. Because my first experience on the road wasn't a whole lot of fun, because I did have a stick up my butt and I was very tight. And I missed home, and I missed my family and my girlfriend. And I wanted to have a different experience this time. And it wasn't that I went overboard. It wasn't that I was drinking every night and partying like the stories you hear, or like the videos in the glam rock era that I loved when I was 12 years old.
I can picture you with like the flowing, long, curly hair and all that stuff. Yeah.
But what happened, I think, was that it just became the kind of thing where it was one tool. It was one way to try to blow off steam, or to deal with the enormous pressure and stress that we were under, and the grueling just pace of everything that we were doing. And there were moments when I think I probably could have been better served on a day off to just rest.
Yeah.
But we were performing, and performance was the number one thing. And we had a moment. It was like, let's just go have some fun, let loose.
Need to, yeah. Or feel like you need to, yeah.
Right, especially if you're like in a new town for the first time. It's like, oh my God, we've never performed in Milan before. And then you're like, well, we could go out to nightclubs and meet some fancy people, and I'm not going to miss out on that.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, well, now we're flying to Australia tomorrow, and I'm hungover, and so there were those moments. Not that I was on stage drunk or too hungover too often or anything like that, but when I lost the ability to perform, and I now had a lot more free time, and feeling really sorry for myself, and in pain physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually.
Yeah.
That's when the drinking went from a tool to have a good time to a way to cope with really negative feelings, to alleviate the pain. It was self-medication at that point.
Yeah.
And so I had already been in a place where I was suffering, and a place where performing had become not just a problem, but an impossibility.
Yeah.
But I was still actually technically a member of the band at that point, and they were kind of waiting for me to come back from my injury, which inside I felt like, well, it's the injury that'll never heal, because it's not just the arm, it's something bigger. There's something wrong with me. And so that fueled the drinking, and then drinking more probably made things worse, both just in terms of my nervous system and my general health and my ability to rebound. So it wasn't the kind of thing where I was on tour and I was blowing it drinking, and it wasn't the kind of thing where they came to me and said, like, we got to kick you out of the band because of your drinking problem.
Right.
It was just that I was trying to cope with what was going on, and it wasn't the best coping mechanism.
Yeah.
It was probably making things worse, and it was probably not helping me it was taking me further from where I needed to be to try to overcome this. Now, that being said, I don't know if it would have gone any differently even if I had been stone cold sober at that point. There was a lot of other stuff going on. It wasn't the main driving force of what was causing the problems physically.
Okay.
But it was a factor in terms of why I wasn't improving. And then I had to leave the band. I had to walk away from the band just as we were getting ready to make the follow-up to Songs About Jane. you talked about identity. I can imagine for you, having been in a band for as long as you have, and then all of a sudden not able to perform, how painful that would be for you after all these years of identifying with that position in band. For me, it was a decade, I guess 12 years at that point, but it was right at the peak of everything that we had ever dreamed of doing was happening. And I was imagining still in my mind, the next phase, the part that we're leading to, is the best part. It's the follow-up album. It's where you make your Blood Sugar Sex Magic. It's where you, you go out and you, from day one, you start at a world arena tour. Yeah. And so that was just absolutely devastating. And I didn't know who I was if I wasn't that guy, because I had built that up in my mind as defining of myself. So that's when the drinking went to another level, because I had at that point no self-esteem. I was in pain on every level, and I had no resources for how to cope with that. I'd been to every kind of doctor you could go to. Some of them had given me pills, some of them had given me, injections and physical therapy, but nothing was really getting to the core of the issue. So I was left with self-medication at that point. Sure. And so I went through the cycle of addiction after that. And it was after I left the band, and it was bad for a year or two at first, and then I went through that illusion of control. There's a chapter in my book called The Illusion of Control, because it's like, I think every alcoholic can attest to this, is there's that moment when you say to yourself, oh, I've got this thing under control. If I, can just drink on the weekends or after 5 o'clock, or only when I'm partying with friends, but not alone. Yeah. You
rationalize it?
It's rationalization. Yeah. And you're in denial, of course. That's the age-old thing that all of us addicts deal with. Yeah. But over time, it always ends up back where it was, or worse. Yeah. Until you're truly humbled by it, and then you end up having to, sooner or later, hopefully, if it's not too late,
get some real help and change the whole game at that point. Yeah. So who else was this affecting? Because you're not out there with the band when it's getting really, the band is out doing that, and you want to be there, and you're suffering. At that point, you were still in a relationship?
Yeah. Well, Sean, who I've been in a relationship for a long time. We had a really tumultuous time there for a while, and I read about that in the book as well, pretty brutally.
And some of the stuff that I'm saying, I'm leading it for those who haven't read the book, and I hope you all read the book because it's great. I guess I'm asking because I try to, through all these podcasts, I'm trying to learn through people, and I'm going through things still. On a daily basis, if not, minute by minute. And I'd like to learn, because my relationship with my wife, Kristen, is so vital to my identity now. Mm-hmm. I don't want to, fall away from that in any way. Was there moments in that with Sean where you knew, I know what, some of this, it's funny because I'm trying to pose it for the podcast. But I guess I want to ask it in a specific way. When you had these issues really coming to a head and you guys had to take time apart, was it the relationship that brought you back? Or was it you knowing you needed to be healthy for you? Or, was there a little bit of both in there?
I think that at certain points, our relationship was a part of the cycle of the things that were destructive in my life, in that we were both trying to help one another, but not in a place to do so. There was that codependency, that goes on. Yes. But then later there was a point at which we were actually really helpful for each other. So I think at different times it was a little bit of each. A little bit of both. Yeah. When you go back to the eye of the storm, when I was on tour and things were coming to a head, there was, I was lost, and I was acting out in ways and hurting her, which ended up, with us breaking up several times and being apart even at one point for a year and a half. And then ending up back together, which at the time, when you look at it through the course of the history of the relationship, it sounds romantic, but at the time probably wasn't even the best choice, because I wasn't better And so there was this draw to each other, but it wasn't necessarily healthy because I was sick, and so, however, when it did get to the end of that addiction cycle, I do give her a lot of credit in terms of being a part of the solution at that point, because essentially I was coming to a place where it was becoming clear to me that it was getting worse, precipitously worse, to the point where I was having, symptoms that suggest that I was in a later stage of alcoholism.
Okay.
But yet still not able to help myself, not able to stop. I would tell myself I'm not going to drink, and then I would still drink. And she was kind of getting over at that point, not because she just didn't have feelings for me anymore, but she was just tired of seeing me
in pain
and doing that to myself.
Yeah.
And so there was a point at which she came to me and she finally said, like, look, I can't see you like this anymore. Like, I don't know what it's going to mean for our relationship. I don't know if it's going to mean you're going to start this whole other journey, and that might mean that this relationship doesn't work anymore because of our history together. It's been this codependent thing in the past, and if it's not that anymore, like, what is it?
Yeah.
But I just know that I care about you too much to see you doing this to yourself, and you need help. And that was the nudge that I needed at that point. I think that I was already starting to feel like that's what I wanted and what I needed, but I didn't have the strength to do it myself. And it was her saying that to me, and not in that moment. She could have been enabling, right? She could have continued to just be like, well, this is what it is, and I'm not going to walk away from it. So, but no, she said, I can't see you like this, and I want to see you happy, whatever that means, even if it's not with me. Yeah. So she helped me. I mean, I was a disaster at that point, and she helped me find a place that had a bed for me to go into detox. And she drove me out. I went to Betty Ford Center out in Rancho Mirage, California, which is like a 2-hour drive from LA. We had a couple days to kill before they had a bed open up, so I kept drinking. She drove me out there and dropped me off, and I had like a 0.39 blood alcohol content or something. That's like that.
Pretty high.
Yeah. I have no memory of them taking me to a room and putting me in a bed and everything. I just woke up like, where am I? And just a flood of anxiety. And I'm sure I can only imagine what she was going through, just taking me out there. And so like the first night or the second night, I was on the phone with her and I was like, get me out of here, come and pick me up. And once again, I give her a lot of credit. She was like, just give it a couple days. I'm sure it's scary. You might feel differently in a couple days. Yeah. Just, you're there. Just see it out. She could have not done that. She could have said, oh, no, I know you're suffering. I'll come and get you. So I give her credit for that. And then, I was there for 2 months.
It's a long time.
Yeah, I was an inpatient for a month. I was in like a sober living kind of thing off campus and coming in during the day for day treatment for a month. And she would come out and visit me, and it was a growing period for both of us. Yeah. I mean, she had to figure out, what is this going to mean for her as much as what it's going to mean for me, and what is it going to mean for our relationship. And so there was an interesting shift that happened in the dynamic, and she was really on board and really a part of my recovery at that point.
I think it's an incredible thing and a beautiful thing for a person to put someone else before themselves.
Yeah.
And for her to do that for you, give you something you really needed and help you find the help that was necessary is incredible and says a lot about her feelings about you, as well as, she wanted you to heal. She wanted you to be okay for you, not for you guys, I think it sounds like. Like she was willing to put you guys aside so that you could be okay. And I think that's something that I think through this effort that I'm doing, I hope people can garner is like a lot of times like you need that, but it's also that we should take note of where we're all at more often and make sure we're doing that for ourselves, or at least trying to, because it's easy when you're in a dark place to be lost and to not know your way out. And sometimes just reflection on yourself can help you get there, but it's also sometimes no matter what you do, you don't, and you need somebody else to help you through that. So I think it's really incredible for, like in life, I think, to have that and to experience it. So I do think you're very lucky to have each other and to have gone through that and grow. Now, when you were at Betty Ford and you're seeing the process of recovery, what parts of it did you find the most stimulating and attractive, meaningful?
Well, being an inpatient at Betty Ford was kind of like a crash course in mental health. It wasn't just addiction for me. It was an education in a lot of things that I hadn't really been exposed to. And the first week or so it's terrifying, because even if you're ready for it, you don't know what that's going to be. You don't know what that journey is going to look like. You don't know what's going to be required of you. All you know is all the things you've been avoiding for however long you've been self-medicating.
Right. Go fight all the monsters.
Exactly.
Yeah, like get in there. Yeah.
And that's just scary. I mean, you're not going to have the tools you've been utilizing, as destructive as they've been. You're not going to have those anymore to deal with it or to escape it. So what are you left with? How are you going to develop new skills? What does that even look like? The most powerful thing for me pretty early on was the discovery of the power of service, being of service. It's something they talk about a lot in the 12-step community. And up until that point, I had heard that, but I didn't know exactly the purpose of it. I mean, in my mind, I imagine they encourage you to be of service, like to go volunteer at a soup kitchen or something like that, right? And that was my image of it. And I thought, well, there's honor in that. But is it essentially to humble you? Is that what it's for? Is to make you feel like I'm not a big shot? Like I'm.
Yeah.
Let me think of others.
Yeah, I get that about you.
What it actually did for me, on top of that, because I never did volunteer at a soup kitchen, but what I did do is, even with like a week or two of recovery, having gained whatever little bit of knowledge I had gained just from showing up and listening to what people had to tell me and gaining the support of my peers and the people who were just a little bit ahead of me in the process.
Okay.
I realized that the people who were coming in behind me, the ones who were just coming out of detox, I actually had something to offer them. Even just in showing them a little bit of kindness, in showing them that I understood where they were at, because I had been there a week or two ago. And if they were shaking like a leaf, I was like, I understand what that feels like. Like, let me help you. Let me walk you over to the dorm. Let me get your bags for you. You just relax. I'll just kind of get you settled and let me introduce you to the program and all that stuff. Just in that very simple act, without having figured that much out yet about me and my recovery, I felt that I had something to offer another human being in a helpful way. Yeah. And that was a powerful feeling of reestablishing self-esteem. The best way to create self-esteem is to do esteemable acts, right? You don't have to feel it in your core that you're a good person or that you have value to do something that has value.
Yeah, there you go.
And so you do something of value and all of a sudden you feel that value. You feel like it doesn't take that much for me to give of myself and to show up in a way that actually is helpful and appreciated. Yeah. And so I kind of got addicted to that feeling. It's a good kind of addiction. It was something to replace the old addiction, the running away and the escaping and avoiding, with something that was just showing up and being present and also getting out of self, because addiction, but really any kind of mental health challenge, there's a certain amount of obsession of self that goes along with it. Okay. We're so consumed with how I'm feeling at this moment. If it's anxiety, it's like, well, how am I going to feel if this happens? How am I going to feel if that happens? Yes. And it's not that you're necessarily egotistical or narcissistic. It's just that you're so consumed with how you're feeling at that moment that it's hard to really be present for other people. Yeah. Being of service can help you get out of that, because you're just showing up for somebody else. You're getting out of that self-obsession. So that was powerful too. I was like, I want more of that, because like I've spent a lot of time in here and in here. I get it. Let me spend a little bit of time out there. Yep. And so that was the thing that inspired me most. I realized like there is something out there more than what I've been living. There is a life that's worth either returning to or showing up for the first time.
Yeah, and creating
this new purpose, this new meaning of life. And that was also incredible because the hardest part and the thing that I've been self-medicating most was the loss of identity and the loss of meaning and purpose that came with the band.
Yes.
That is what I had made the center focus of my identity and my self-definition. So what was I going to replace that with? Now I was discovering new passions, new talents, even new things that I didn't realize, or I'd forgotten that I had. I'd forgotten that I was a compassionate person, that I was able to show up for others with empathy.
Yeah.
When I was drinking till I passed out on my couch every night, I wasn't exactly showing up for other people with empathy.
Yeah.
I was just concerned with how I was feeling in that moment. So rediscovering that or discovering it for the first time, whatever it was, this was new passion, new purpose, and just going through that program and learning about all the different ways in which people become addicted, the different ways in which people find ways out of addiction. And then you realize this addiction is just a symptom, right? Everyone here has their own story and their own thing that they are medicating, some kind of pain. And so that was my first introduction to trauma work, really, understanding why people end up with some of the problems they end up with, that it's not their fault.
Yeah.
They're not responsible for how they became sick.
Yes.
They are responsible for how they get well. They're responsible for their recovery. Nobody can do it for them but themselves.
Yes.
However, it's when you are blaming yourself, that's the shame that drives your addiction and keeps you in these negative
Cycles.
patterns.
Yeah.
So it was just, my God, like it was like in inpatient, it was like I went to kindergarten to learn how to live again. And then when I was in that date treatment program, it was like I was in grad school for just all these ways in which psychology informs both what's healthy and what can end up going haywire in our psychology and how we navigate living. So I was just really charged up after the first couple of months, and then I went to an outpatient program for a few months. And when I graduated that program, they asked me if I wanted to stay on as a volunteer, just doing like peer support, offering empathy and compassion, telling my story, running some groups and stuff. And I was like, that sounds amazing. I mean, this is like, can you imagine?
It's like, that's what's helping me right now. I want more of that.
Selfishly, I'm like, you know, but
well, we're human.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's that age-old question: is there such a thing as a selfless good deed? If it makes you feel good to be good, is there anything wrong with that?
Right.
I mean, we should all feel good to be good, right?
Totally.
And if it helps us be better and be well, to be good to others and to offer ourselves in a helpful way, then I think there's no real downside to that. Right?
Totally, I'm with you.
So I volunteered for like 2+ years at this outpatient center for addictions.
Is that 2 hours from home, 2 hours from everyone? Or is that the outpatient is like closer to home?
No, it was close to home. Yeah,
Okay.
I was at Betty Ford for 2 months.
Okay.
That's 2 hours away from here. When I came back here, I found...
That's the outpatient. Okay.
Yeah, an outpatient clinic right down the street.
I see. Okay. I wasn't sure if you like stayed closer to that. Okay.
Yeah, after the 2 months, so another like 3 or 4 months back here at an outpatient, and then like 2+ years of volunteering for this program. And in the course of that, it's weird. Doing the things that I'm doing now, I didn't have like a 5-year plan of this is where I was headed.
Yes.
I just showed up each day with a feeling of purpose. Whatever it was that made me feel fulfilled in that moment, kept me sober, kept me on my track in terms of recovery, but also felt like new passion and purpose in my life. That was the only thing that was leading me forward. And being a volunteer was the natural next step from being an inpatient and an outpatient.
Yeah.
And then I had noticed that there were people around me that were counselors, that were therapists, who had a similar backstory, that had been addicts themselves and had, gotten clean in midlife, in their 40s, whatever, had gone back to school to become a therapist or counselor.
Yeah.
I was noticing that was a trend of people that were working in that field. Who better to work with people who are struggling, the people who have personal experience with that. And then also I was getting a lot of positive feedback, and that was helpful for my self-esteem. Anyone who tells you you don't need any external validation to feel good about yourself is lying to you.
Yeah.
I think we all need, from the time that we're born, we need the love of our parents to inform our esteem of ourselves. Right?
Totally. I'm with you on that.
And I think that there's nothing wrong with necessarily seeking some amount of external validation. If that's the only source, If you're looking externally for everything and there's a void internally and you're not able to fill that for yourself, that's a problem. But if you're looking at what is fulfilling for you and you're giving yourself love and compassion, and then you're able to walk out in the world and show up, it feels good to realize, oh, I'm doing things that people like, or I'm showing up in ways that actually I have value in the world. So the idea that that I was impacting people in a positive way, that when I spoke in a group, that people came up to me afterwards and said, that was really articulate. That helped me a lot understand my own addiction and my recovery. And that I don't know, it just gave me these new skills.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful to be of service in that way and to like define your own purpose by giving other people support, feedback, and purpose themselves and helping them through what was very challenging to get through.
Yeah.
Such a special thing to have in your life.
Yeah.
I mean, as you figured out that was something that made you feel good by doing good, how did you turn over into knowing that you wanted to help people on a broader scale and become a mental health therapist, which I'm in awe of, and I think it's such a wonderful way to still be creative because you're co-creating with people and helping them find that better way to live on a regular basis. And that's not easy as someone who's going through therapy now and dealing with, my own demons and issues and challenges that are very unique to my own circumstance. I think it's a really amazing thing. Like my therapist is so helpful. And I know you met all these people that had a track that was similar, but there's only one you. How was it for you that you realized, okay, like I need to do that. That's a great purpose. I can roll with it.
So I've been getting some feedback, and of course it was, I was honored that they asked me to volunteer and all that stuff. But then I had people asking me, have you thought about doing this for a career? You seem to have a knack for it and a passion for it. And I honestly hadn't at that point.
Okay.
I had been noticing that others had a similar backstory, but then I was like, maybe I should consider this. And what was interesting too is that I'd spent so much time avoiding responsibility when I was in my addiction, and anything that was a potential opportunity in my life, I either wouldn't have even noticed it, or if I did, it was scary and I wasn't in a place where I was able to pursue it.
Okay.
And yet when somebody said that to me, or a couple people said that to me, I was like, and I didn't hesitate.
Yeah.
I was just like, that makes a lot of sense. And that seems like that would be a fulfilling thing to do. And then I just got on the computer and I started Googling, graduate programs. How do you become a drug counselor? How do you become, and essentially I just wanted to work at a clinic like that.
Yeah.
And I'd been doing it for free. I might as well get paid. And I realized, well, you have to be a therapist. You have to get a license as a therapist. And in order to do that, you have to have a master's degree in clinical psychology. It's like, oof.
But you had already completed UCLA?
Yeah, thankfully.
So you weren't starting completely from scratch, but you had to do a lot.
That's another one of those weird miracles in life.
Yeah.
I don't know how I managed to get my undergraduate degree in the middle of everything that happened with the band. Somehow the timing worked out and I was able to get it done.
That's incredible. I mean, I can speak to that as like I literally left college to have the career with the band. I mean, it's not easy to do those two things. They're very like counterproductive because like living the life of travel and working at odd hours and having all kinds of promo stuff in the morning and the midday, and then you do your concert at night. I mean, that is challenging. So,
well, it wasn't exactly that. What it was, I mean, I was the oldest guy in the band. Okay. And so I was 2 grades ahead of the other guys. Oh. So when we
yeah, I'm like personalizing this whole thing.
No, it's all good. I can't wait to hear your story with all that.
On your podcast, I'll get into that.
Absolutely. So when I graduated high school, I did a couple of years at UCLA while they were still finishing school when we were making the Cars Flowers album.
Okay.
Granted, those 2 years I didn't have a whole lot of credits to show because we were making a record and I thought I was leaving and that was going to be the end of it.
Yeah.
But we did go out on tour and came back with our tails between our legs because that record didn't sell.
Yeah.
And so I re-enrolled at UCLA, and during the period between the Cars Flowers album and the Maroon 5 record, I did 3 more years of college, and I got my degree during that time, right before we made Songs About Jane. I graduated. So the timing just worked out that in that space, in that evolution period I was talking about earlier, I was back at school. That was when I was having this social life and all this inspiration.
Okay. Yeah.
So anyway, I got a degree in English, though, and I had no idea if that was going to apply to, go into a master's program in psychology.
Okay.
So I just started looking at places online, and I realized there were places that I could apply. And I realized with a UCLA degree, a degree from UCLA, which is a pretty prestigious school, that I had some choices. And a lot of support from the people that were my sober friends and people in that community, really kind of giving me the nudge that I needed to push myself. And I applied to the master's program at Pepperdine University. I got in, and like a month later, I'm showing up to class, and I'm back in school 20 years later.
It's awesome.
And some of the people there were, just out of undergrad, and there were some people that were in their 40s like me. And that was the most exciting thing I'd done in a long time. And it was also another level of therapy for me because, on top of the alcoholism, I had a really severe anxiety disorder. I mean, I was basically agoraphobic at the end of my drinking. I couldn't go out of the house without a buzz on,
Okay.
And I was self-medicating, and I was having panic attacks, and it was all this stuff that was just exhausting and painful.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to class every day, and I'm around people all the time, and then having to participate in class, and at a certain point give lectures in class. You have a project and you have to present. And so all of my old trauma from being on stage and came back, and I had to work through that. And so it was really, I felt like I was in grad school when I was at Betty Ford. Now I was literally in grad school and getting such a high education about this stuff. And I think that what dawned on me at that point, and the reason why I really knew that this was my path, was that a lot of these people that I was going to school with were highly intelligent people. Obviously, they were getting their master's degree.
Yeah.
Some of them had studied psychology in undergrad and were just going right out of school and they'd been wanting to do this their whole life. But most of them didn't have the life experience that I had. Everything that I'd been through informed the therapist that I was becoming. And all of the things that I had gone through, the pain that I had suffered had new meaning, because it was a part of a process of turning that into something that I could offer people. And so I realized that...
That's powerful.
Yeah, it was. That was a powerful moment for me as a person in my development as a therapist, in my understanding of just the journey that we go on in life and why we learn lessons and why the most painful things sometimes can be the things that give us the biggest gifts.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to relive all of it again.
Doesn't sound like,
but
that would be healthy.
I'm for what
Totally.
came from.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that's the beauty of living in these bodies is you can't go backwards and you learn a lot, and as you learn, as long as you're, in my opinion, as long as you're growing and trying your best each day, because that's going to change too, what you're capable of, whether your body's ready for it or your mind's ready for it, you just keep trying and you keep learning. That's the whole thing of this body, the way I know it. I think it's really powerful to know that no matter how old you get, you can learn new things, you can do new things, you can create new things. That never stops, and it can change of where that focus takes you, and also how it affects other people. I think for guys like us, we like that that response that, when you put something out there that you're getting some feedback, I think, from people, but also we like to know the other side of it, why that is. And I think I'm curious as a therapist, and I know I'm not asking anything about anybody's personal stuff, but when you find yourself talking to patients and hearing from them, how do you internalize, do you go back into your oh, I have to think about it from their perspective and I can liken that to a time in my life? Do you get into that, or is it more of an objective standpoint from the education you received?
It's a combination of both.
Okay.
Obviously, you have to maintain a certain amount of objectivity and not assume that your experience is the same as others. Even though we all are human beings that share a lot of the same human experiences, the particulars of someone's life and what informs what they're going through may be very different.
Yeah.
And there is a tendency, I think, early on as a therapist to jump to, oh, I know all about this because I've lived that.
Okay.
And you have to be, you have to kind of make sure you're not biased. We're all biased to a certain degree, and you can't eliminate bias completely.
Yeah.
But just to make sure that you're challenging your bias and checking it with a certain amount of, well, what are the other things that may be going on here? And let me make sure that we're fleshing out this situation, because the client is first. It's their story. It's the context of their lives that matters most to how you're going to approach it.
Sure.
However, that being said, like I said, I think that I bring my personal experience and life experience into what I do. And it's beneficial because I do have personal experience with a lot of the things that my clients struggle with.
Yes.
And I will tell personal anecdotes if I think that it's not just apropos, but might actually be helpful for them.
Yeah.
That's a fine line you have to walk. I mean,
Right. You don't want to relate to every piece of their experience.
and you don't want to make it about you.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that you're not doing it because it's like, well, that reminds me of a story. Like, let me tell you and entertain you with my story.
Right.
It's like there is a place for self-disclosure in the helping profession. And the main one really is just connection. The person, at least when I was a client, and I'm always going to be a client, a patient.
Yeah.
The last thing I want is a therapist that I feel is just taking notes and kind of observing me like as if I'm behind glass.
Yeah. Like
very
not an
clinically.
active listening kind of situation.
Well, more than that, I think
Yeah.
even you want somebody that you feel like is a human being that's connected to you.
I see.
That you're able to have an intimate experience with, because that's corrective. That's something to be seen and accepted, and for somebody to have a human experience with you. That's part of the process. At least for me, everyone's different. I mean, that's why there's different kinds of therapists with different modalities.
Yeah.
Not everyone responds to the same thing. And I have to remember that. I'm not going to be the right therapist for everyone, but I might be the perfect therapist for some people.
Sure.
So I try to be authentic to me. That's your instrument. In the same way that as an artist, you have to bring yourself into your art.
Yeah.
I think as a therapist, unless you're talking about being a medical doctor where you have to be very sterilized and do things by the book, we're in a profession that's human beings relating to human beings.
Yeah.
And so bringing your own self, bringing your authentic self into the room, I think is a powerful tool that you can use to create that connection, to foster a trust and a belief that through this relationship, we're going to collaborate on solutions to your problems. So it is a little bit of both.
Yeah.
And I probably do self-disclose more than a lot of therapists, I think, because I've lived such a unique life, and I do have a lot of stories, but the first question I always ask myself, if I have an inclination to share a story or to share from my personal experiences, is this benefiting the client? Is this something that's actually going to offer them something they don't currently have? And then if the answer is yes, then absolutely, tell that story.
That's great. I think that's a smart way to go about it. Not that I know anything about being a therapist. I think that's a very wise approach. First of all, this has been like a very, very deep, awesome conversation. I appreciate all your openness and vulnerability. A couple more questions. I mean, the thing that I want to bring up now is something we spoke of on the phone. I've been trying to do these preparative interviews, and I find I have like really interesting connections on those calls in a way that I'm like, oh, I wish I had recorded that. Maybe I'll start doing it. I don't know. But one thing you said really stood out to me, and we spoke of it again yesterday before I drove up to LA. And it was that, through the therapy sessions, a general thing that you learned is that, or have garnered, I guess, from the experiences, is that people's problems kind of emulate society's problems, or the things that people embody as problems are relative to society's problems. Mm-hmm. If I'm butchering it, please tell me. But I'd like to hear you kind of go into that, because to me it was a fascinating thought. is that like we're like microorganisms of the world we live in, which I know we are, but it's also like in terms of the mental health aspects of that, as someone who's lived through your own issues, is obviously like come out the other side in a bright, beautiful way, in my opinion, and now helping other people with theirs. I'd love to hear your perspective of that.
Well, this was something that I started to gain a perspective on when I was still early in recovery, just I think when I was volunteering, and just noticing the ways in which people's minds can go awry a bit in their addictive thinking, and how it was similar to what I see in cultural and societal levels of just some of the extreme thinking, the overcompensations, the polarizations, the trying to solve one problem by creating a whole other problem by going to the other end. And that's essentially what addiction is at its essence. And you look at, there's so much of that in our culture in the way that we can't seem to find the middle ground. It's black or it's white.
What do they call that? Splitting?
That's one way to describe it. But I have such a more of a vocabulary for it now because obviously having studied this stuff. But yeah, splitting is from the perspective of like the early child. Basically, as a young child, you only have a binary view of things. It's like if I'm fed and mommy's looking at me with love, that I'm good, that I'm love, and everything is good.
Okay.
If I'm unfed and I'm hungry, then everything's bad and I'm bad and she's bad and then she feeds me and then I'm good and she's good and everything's good, right? So that's like a very early developmental way of seeing the world. Is this just light switch, because you haven't developed any emotional maturity at that point. And then you have to go through all the stages of development where you go through the narcissistic phase where you start to realize at like age 2, oh, I have a separate perspective from my parents, and I can say no. You know?
Your authority means nothing to me. I'm 4 years old. Or,
So that's where you first start to individuate and have autonomy and recognize it's not just whatever you say, and I have to be on board with that.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more nuance to that, and I have my own ego, and I can get my own... Anyway,
you get
the point.
I'm getting you.
And that evolves over time. Hopefully, if you continue to evolve, if there's more and more nuance to this idea, and you recognize that you're both connected to other people and the world around you, but you're also your own individual person, and you have your own autonomy, and there's essentially no separating the individual system that we are with the external systems. So this is systems theory. I don't want to get too technical in my...
I'm not that smart. So.
Well, I'll try to put it in layman's terms, because this is something that I bring into like a lot of the things I talk about with my clients, and you don't need to understand these sort of theoretical orientations. It's just that when we look at ourselves as a human organism, we're not monolithic. We're not just one thing. We're a set of a lot of subsystems, right? Even just biologically, like every organ in our body, every cell in our body is a system.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop there. We're a system that's made up of subsystems, but then the family is a system. And then the community is a system that's larger than that. And the city and the state and the country and the world and the universe. Like, it never ends. It's from the
tiniest
microorganism all the way up to galaxies and universe. They're all just interlocking systems, right? And so every system can be functioning it can be functional or dysfunctional. Right? Some families are functional, some are dysfunctional. But essentially, they all are trying to establish equilibrium. They all have a homeostasis, right, that they're trying to maintain. And so when something gets out of whack, and we see this in families, it's like the parents are fighting, there's a reaction to that within the system. The kid's got a drug problem, or the kid's acting out in school, or it's a reaction to something else that's going on in the system. What I noticed, and I didn't have a vocabulary for it then, but I do now, is that what goes on inside of us, the parts of us that make up our psyche, are no different than the larger systems in society in that regard. When we have a wounded part of us, when something has gone askew because of trauma or something that was painful in our life, there's a reaction to that within us. There's a way that we try to cope with that. And it can be a very productive, very adaptive part of us that arises in reaction to a painful part. But it might be functional at the time that it arises, but becomes problematic later when it's a pattern that's no longer serving you, a behavior that's no longer serving you.
Yes.
Like when you're 16 years old, if you're dealing with abuse and trauma, all kinds of things, going out and getting wasted with your friends might be the most adaptive thing you could do at that point to escape and not be sitting in that pain all the time.
Yeah.
Right? It's a strategy that might help you actually get through it at that time. However, you fast forward 10 years, if that same behavior is preventing you from getting anywhere in your life because it actually becomes self-defeating or it's killing you, the same thing that was a helpful adaptive mechanism for coping has now become maladaptive. So I see that as the strategies that we take on an unconscious level to cope with our own struggles.
Yes.
Whether they be really proactive, healthy things like going out and trying to achieve things in our life and exert some control over our lives, or reactive things that can be destructive. None of those parts are bad.
Yeah.
They're all trying to serve a function to help us cope with something. And that's the same thing that I see in our society, in our culture. It's like have been things that have been historically wrong with the ways in which we've gone about trying to deal with things. We want to correct those things, but every time you change something, that homeostasis is thrown out of balance and there's a reaction to it to try to pull it back into balance. And more often than not, if you don't have that healthy core, that balance in the center, which is the goal of the kind of therapy that I'm talking about,
yes,
is to be self-led, to have an authentic core self that is able to offer compassion to these parts and to bring them back into alignment so that they're all functioning in that optimal equilibrium.
Yeah.
The same thing is true in our culture in that if we don't have that center, that balance, the thing that unites and keeps all of those parts together, you just see more and more polarization of reaction. It's like, this is wrong, so I'm going to do this, and that's equally wrong, and then I'm going to do this, and we get more and more separate.
The pendulum keeps swinging.
Yeah, and but I try to look at it as cynical as that can sound, and as cynical as I can be. I try to look at it the same way I look at my clients. It's like it's not irreparable, and it doesn't mean that at our core we're broken. Mm-hmm. At the core of all of us, we have something that is pure, something that is courageous and compassionate and curious and able to find the middle ground between things and the balance point. We just have become more and more askew from it or been more ruled by those forces that might be destructive patterns. How we correct that on a societal level is a little bit more difficult than when you have one person in your office. But I see the same potential for how we heal some of the wounds and the things that we deal with on a cultural level.
Yeah, well, I think it's really well put the way you're saying it. You're very articulate with that, and I think it's something we should all be thinking about is as much how we are internally as how we are with our community. I think it's lost that we're generally able to listen to our neighbors if we don't agree with them, and I think that's emblematic of not listening to that other side of ourselves that maybe will help us tune into what's healthy, and that's the what could be bad about our own mental health is that you don't always see what's behind the thing that you're looking at. And for me, I'm still processing those things in my everyday life. And conversations like this help me understand myself as well as the world. So you saying that to me gives me a clearer picture of how I can interact with myself as well as others. And I think we all have a responsibility in I guess America, maybe not the whole world. And I think also like America versus the whole world or in regards to how we relate to the whole world is a whole other conversation. But within our own ecosystem of America, it's something I'm realizing is a big part of this podcast is that the discussions are really applicable to the community of the United States. And I don't think it's like everybody is as different as we're being influenced to think and all those things. But I guess my final question to kind of wrap all this up is what can we all do, as individuals, having learned how you went through your challenges, what's something that you really found helpful for you that people might be able to incorporate that might be very complicated, but it also might be very simple? Like what is something that was like a gear turner for you?
Well, you hear a lot of people that are talking publicly about self-improvement or self-help, and there's a lot of pop psychology out there and things that there's more dialogue about this now, which is both healthy and wonderful. I'm glad that there's a discourse, but there's also a lot of stuff out there that's not necessarily always helpful because it's like oversimplified or skipping over certain steps that are important in terms of taking the time and the patience that's required in your own work and therapy. The thing that I see as the step that gets skipped over the most, that is essential to the work that I do as a therapist, is the step of looking inward with curiosity and compassion. So much we think about the changes we need to make, the behaviors we want to change, the mindset that we need to have to do that, the motivation, the determination, the discipline. So often when we do that, we end up comparing ourselves against the things that we're falling short of, the finished product that we're not at yet, or comparing to others the external visions of what success, whatever that means,
and
looks
focusing on like our flaws and things like that.
We end up actually becoming self-defeating because there's judgment in that, and we focus on the flaws, on things that are imperfect, and we become self-critical. So I think the starting point for any kind of growth, any kind of healing, is self-compassion. It's looking inward, noticing, instead of noticing that there's a part of you that can be an angry, resentful part, or a part that's a procrastinating part, and going, I got to fix that. That's a bad part of me. I want to change that about me. Instead of jumping to the fixing, first approaching that part with curiosity. Removing the judgment, approaching it, we're like, well, there's a reason why that part has become a part of me. And it probably was serving a function at some point. It was probably an adaptive thing, a coping mechanism that served me at one point. So let me get a better understanding of the history of this part of me. Let me understand its story better. When you offer a part of you that kind of compassion and curiosity, you're offering yourself compassion. But you're also allowing yourself to fall into this place of observer, which separates you from those symptoms. And makes you realize, I'm not that thing. Because we so often identify with the problems that we have. I am my depression. I am my anxiety. I am my trauma. And you're not. It's just a part of you that you carry with you as a part of your experience. But it's not the core of you. The core of you is the part that can observe those things and notice them. So noticing them with curiosity, with compassion, is the first step of separating from them. Not that we're going to banish them from our minds completely, but ideally what we'd like to see is for them to heal and grow to the point where they're not burdened with this role that they've been carrying of trying to protect us with whatever strategy has become self-destructive. And so when you do that, you actually have the first step and a more solid footing in moving forward towards any changes that you're going to make. And then when you do want to have determination and you do want to move into the world, you have self-love in the process rather than self-judgment and self-criticism. And then you're able to walk into the world with the same curiosity and compassion and show up for other people the same way that you showed up for yourself. And that allows you to do anything you're doing with more grace. Even if you're a go-getter and you're doing something and you want to be really successful in the world, when you're able to do it from that core authentic self and a place of curiosity and real confidence, not compensation, not ego compensation, but real confidence. That's when you have the best outlook and outcome for the things that you pursue.
Game changer answer right there. Honestly, looking inward with curiosity and compassion is something I'm going to keep with me for the rest of my days. That is something I need to do more, and I think we can all benefit from. So I love that thought. Thank you. And I loved being here with you. This was a really incredible moment. I think you're like the first person someone suggested. Sandy Abrams suggested that we speak, and she sends her love. And I'm really thankful for that reconnection and that we could be here together. I'm honestly I'm touched that you invited me into your home, your beautiful, amazing studio, took time out of your life to chat, and hopefully we can impact some people with this conversation. And to everybody out there listening, thank you for being here. If you need to talk to someone. This isn't meant to be your answer. Your answer is within you and out there for you to find. And, we're really grateful, I think, to be able to have a little impact if we did. And, and I'm going to let Ryan go to sleep.
I was going to sneeze.
It's getting late.
I'm like, he's almost done. Let me hold it in just
This is perfect. No, you should sneeze, and that's the closer. I love it.
Of course, I mentioned it. Now it's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's how sneezes always just go. You have to mention them, and they're gone. Okay, so everyone, thank you, and we will see you for the next What Could Be Bad. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
man.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate this so much.
Appreciate you.
All right, later, guys.